And by way of background, in October of this year, there was a national public opinion survey done, in which three-quarters of Canadians, 3 out of 4, said they were harmed by the health protection measures adopted to deal with COVID-19. These are not harms from COVID-19, which have been well documented and which were substantial, but these were harms as a result of the health protection measures adopted. And these fell into 4 categories: health harms, harms due to the lengthening of the waiting lines, the inaccessibility of the Canadian healthcare system, negative consequences affected with some of the vaccines. They included harms to rights and freedoms guaranteed by the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, many of which are being litigated in the lower courts. They included social harms as a result of social distancing and social isolation, particularly those experienced by older people and by children as a result of the school lockdowns. And they included economic harms. In fact, when the pollsters asked which of these categories of harms did people feel affected the largest number of Canadians, in other words, affected the country as a whole, as distinct from affecting them personally or their family, the economic harms came up at the top of the list. So at this inquiry, what we're looking for is witnesses to testify as to the impacts of these measures on their personal and family lives, personal stories. But we're also looking for expert testimony, particularly from experts whose alternative medical narratives or alternative scientific narratives were ignored or even censored during the time of the pandemic. And as I stressed at the beginning, and I've stressed each time, at the end of the day, what the commissioners will be looking for from these witnesses is not just the stories, not just the negatives, and not just the alternative narratives, but recommendations as to what could have been done differently so that those harms were either avoided or at least mitigated. And proposals for submissions. If people are watching or learning of this today and wish to testify at these hearings, either as to personal stories or as expert witnesses, the place to go to is nationalcitizensinquiry.ca/hearings, nationalcitizensinquiry.ca/hearings, and make your proposal for a submission there. Yes, thank you, Richard. All of these hearings will be bilingual, have a bilingual capacity, but the first 2 will be in, the first one will be in Moncton and the second one will be in Montreal. So it's very important that particularly folks from those areas make their appeal to provide submissions for those inquiries in either French or English. Just one example, and there are actually hundreds of these, of the type of story that we expect to hear because they are being told elsewhere. This is just a sample from Brian and Kelly, who were the owners of a fitness center in the GTA. In fact, they were just opening their second location when the COVID pandemic hit. The Ontario government locked them down for, initially they were told this would be just for 2 weeks to flatten the curve, but that turned into virtually a 2-year lockdown of their business. They tried to adjust by getting into online training and things of that type, but the government then came out with an order that businesses such as theirs were to not operate above 30% capacity, which meant that they were virtually, it was virtually impossible to achieve the revenue required to sustain the business if you could only operate at 30% capacity. Eventually they did everything they could. They took out the loans that the government was offering, but then they were required to sign personal guarantees. And then when March 2022 came and the restrictions finally ended, most of their customers had gone, and they were unsuccessful in getting most of them back. They had many of their customers have bought their own equipment or found other ways of providing their physical exercise rather than through that type of a gym. In October, they had to let all their staff go, which was 10 Canadians who then had to go on either welfare or UI. They were forced to default on their loans and faced bankruptcy with no prospect in the immediate future of opening up that business. And these are the types of stories. This is just on the economic side. There are hundreds and hundreds of these, but these are the type of people that are expected to testify at this hearing as to the impacts, and to be asked at the end of the day what could have been done differently in order to avoid or mitigate these types of negative consequences. So I think that's enough from me. And if there are any questions, I'd be more than happy to respond to them.
Preston, maybe Richard can just translate your last remarks and then we'll take the question.
Yes. And this story is attached en français to the news release as well. Yes, Richard. Okay, so any questions?
Please raise your hand if you'd like to ask a question. We have a number of media. Okay, Stephanie Levitz, please go ahead.
Hi, Preston. It's Stephanie Levitz from the Toronto Star. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can.
Okay, wonderful. I came in a bit late, so I'm sorry if you addressed this off the top. But my takeaway here is that the hearings are set to begin. I wondered if I could ask you again about where the funding from all of this is coming from.
Well, that's a good question. We're hoping to have a good answer to it. Right now, the only way, if people go to this website, nationalcitizensinquiry.ca, there's a couple of things that are being asked for. One is to indicate, do you want this type of inquiry to be heard? Secondly, who would you trust to be commissioners? And then, as we're announcing today, if you're prepared to testify, there's a way to do that. But the other thing that's on that website is a donate button. And at the present time, the only source of funding for this is donations that come from people that want to see it happen. And we're making every appeal that we can to get it funded that way.
Okay. Just as a follow-up, I mean, how do you envision this doesn't turn into just a national gripe fest? I mean, there are 38 million people in this country, give or take, and I would submit that every single person in this country has a story about how their life was upended by COVID. Personally, medically, professionally, economically. I mean, it touched every Canadian. And does this end up just being a giant therapy session, or how do you guide it to
Well, that's a very good
answers?
Question, one that we've wrestled with, and there's a number of measures that can be taken to try to ensure that that does not occur. The first is this emphasis that I keep making at every one of these news conferences, and when people contact the website, that at the end of the day, you're going to be asked, oh, okay, we've heard the negatives, we've heard the bad impacts, et cetera, but what could you recommend that could have been done differently to avoid that? To try to end up with a package of positive recommendations, not just a recitation of gripes. Secondly, people that testify, and this is a good point, a good time to make it here, will be asked to swear or to affirm. There'll be a commissioner for oaths at each of these hearings, so that the people that testify will be asked to affirm that what they are telling is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. And secondly, they'll be advised that they will be subjected to cross-examination. So if this becomes just a blaming session or a griping session, there will be cross-examination that will pull that out and make that fairly clear that that's unacceptable if that's all that you got to say. So there's a number of measures like that that can be taken. The other measure, and I've said this to people, is watch the first one or two of these hearings. And if you think it's getting slanted one way or the other, or there's certain testimony that's not being heard, then apply to testify and self-correct it. Don't just sit there and complain and say, well, this is skewed or it's going the wrong way. Provide the antidote to that, and there'll be an opportunity to do that. So there's about 4 measures to try to avoid the concern that you raise, and other people have raised that as well.
I don't know if there's anybody else waiting for questions, but I have one more that I'll get into, and that just relates to the risk of misinformation and disinformation becoming publicized in all of this, and people trafficking. And, you know, there are concerns, legitimate otherwise, about vaccines, about the pandemic itself, about the virus not being real. I mean, there's a lot of information circulating out there that might be considered problematic. How do you account for that in this environment and not necessarily amplifying things that certainly just aren't true?
Well, as I say, if people think that something is being said is misinformation, then apply to testify to provide the information. This has a self-correcting mechanism if people will participate, and not just sit back and say, oh, well, that's misinformation, that's misleading, and do nothing about it. Okay, you go and testify, but understand that you will be asked if what you are saying is true. And that oath is a significant oath. That's why it's framed the way it is. It's not just what you're saying is true, that there's some truth there, but it's the whole truth. That if you know other sides of the story, you're telling the whole truth, not just part of it. And that and there's nothing but the truth. You're not embellishing it with a whole bunch of other stuff that has nothing to do with what you're saying. So hopefully there's a self-correcting mechanism in here. And I'd say particularly the people that are afraid or concerned about misinformation, the best way you can ensure that that does not occur is to participate, not to just sit back and criticize it. Okay, are there other questions? Those are very good questions, because the credibility of this exercise depends on a number of things. It depends on the large numbers of people want it. It depends on the credibility of these commissioners. That's why we're asking people, who would you trust? It depends on the credibility of these witnesses and whether the straight story can be obtained by the measures that I've mentioned.
Thank you. Matthew Horwood, please.
Hi, Preston. Matthew with the Western Standard. I just want to ask you about comments made a couple weeks ago by the NDP's health critic, Don Davies. He said that the proposed inquiry are an example of the Conservatives wanting to play political games with a partisan pandemic panel led by you. Just like to get your comments on what you think of that, and if this is a partisan pandemic panel, in your opinion.
Well, we're doing everything we can to make it not so. The invitation for commissioners, for example, is extended to anybody. There's no partisan criteria there. And the measures that I've mentioned are to endeavor to make sure this is as non-skewed and non-biased as possible. What is interesting, one of the signs that the time to do something is right is when a number of people come to similar conclusions. The NDP federal critic, while he got on in partisan remarks, they called for a federal inquiry into the COVID business. Dr. Tam, 6 weeks ago, said that her agency would welcome further questions on this. There's a Liberal backbencher, I believe, that has a private members bill calling for an inquiry. So there's a number of people calling for inquiry. Most of these calls are for the government itself to hold the inquiry, which has problems with respect to a slant, because you're asking the governments to investigate themselves. So what we're saying is this would, the best chance of this being as impartial as possible if it's independently led, citizen-led, not led by either by the government or by the opposition parties. And the other point, a lot of the discussion on COVID is let's apply the scientific method to these problems. The scientific method says experiment, go and do the thing, and then judge it on the basis of the evidence produced. Don't speculate in advance. To prejudge is actually, the root of the words is same as prejudice. Don't prejudge this thing. Let's go and do it. And then at the end decide whether was this subjectively conducted or was it skewed or not.
Great. Thank you, Preston.
Okay, a couple of questions that come to the website that pertain to this. One is, does the testimony have to be just about federal government health protection measures. And we should make it clear, no, this testimony can pertain to the implications of federal government health protection measures, provincial or municipal. It's not just confined to the federal jurisdiction. A second question here was, how many witnesses do you anticipate during the inquiry? Well, that's going to depend. The current schedule is to have 2 to 3 days of testimony. There was a group in Toronto in June put on a kind of a sample of what a public hearing might look like. I think they confined the testimony to 15 minutes each, and they managed to hear 60. They had 60 witnesses over 3 days. Whether that'll be the pattern for this is not yet clear, but there'll probably be between 300 and 400 witnesses, depending on the amount of time that the commissioners are prepared to allocate to each witness, particularly to the expert witnesses. Okay, so are there other?
Oh, I was going to just let Richard translate that.
Yep. And so the concluding message is we're calling for witnesses, personal stories, expert witnesses, and if you wish to participate in that way, go to nationalcitizensinquiry.ca/hearings and indicate your desire to make a submission. So thank you, everybody. And
Preston, sorry, we have one more question. Can we take one more question?
Certainly.
Yeah,
Sorry. Yep.
From Tamara, please go ahead.
Oh, hi, Mr. Manning. Thank you. It's Tamara Ubalini from Rebel News here. I just had a question about your expert witnesses. I wonder how they're being chosen and if any health officials or sitting elected politicians have agreed yet to partake.
Well, when we get the indications that people are willing to testify, and particularly expert witnesses, there'll be a committee that will try to go through these and try to get some balance. One of the things we're concerned about is that we don't get one hearing all loaded up, let's say, with economic expertise and economic impacts and nothing on the health side or the social side or the civil liberties side. So there'll be a committee to try to get that kind of balance, and then ultimately the commissioners themselves will decide who they're willing to hear, and so that'll be the process there. What was the other part of your question there? Sorry, I don't think I answered it completely.
I wondered if any health officials or current sitting or elected politicians have agreed to partake.
Yes, not at this stage, and and this was pointed out at one of our earlier press conferences. Someone pointed out that if this hearing was being held under the Public Inquiries Act, to say the federal act or a provincial Public Inquiries Act, the commissioners could subpoena witnesses. They could actually compel someone, say health authorities, to testify. This hearing will not have that capacity. All it will be able to do is invite some of those officials to testify. And you know, if they sympathize with the spirit in which this is being done, and hopefully some of them will comply. If they refuse, it does raise the question, why? Have they got something to hide? And you can bring some media and public pressure to bear on them. But at this stage, we're just publicizing this, and we're hopeful that some of the expertise will actually come from the government and from some of the people that gave advice to the authorities during the actual pandemic.
Thank you.
I see Global News, CPAC, CTV. Would you have any questions for Mr. Manning? Do you have any closing remarks then, Preston?
Okay, no, I think we've talked enough. Just nationalcitizensinquiry.ca/hearings. We're calling for witnesses to tell their stories or to provide expert testimony. Thank you very much.
Thank you.